Homeland and Treaties Paper by Jatin Jain and Amar Tiwari. Treaties are a constitutionally recognized agreement between indigenous people and the Crown, which describe the exchanges where indigenous nations agree to share some of their interests in their ancestral lands in return for various payments and promises. These treaties included activities such as the right to hunt, fish, and harvest, the establishment of reserved land, and the payment of annuities, among others. There are 46 treaties covering the province of Ontario, including 3 numbered treaties, 2 Robinson treaties, 2 Williams treaties, and 30 Upper Canada treaties. The Williams Treaty in specific transferred more than 20,000 square kilometers of land in southern Ontario in exchange for a one-time cash payment to the Indigenous signatories. The Williams Treaties included 2 treaties, which signed with the Chippewa and the Mississauga First Nations. These are the Chippewa-Williams Treaty, which signed from the Georgian Bay to the Ottawa River, and the Mississauga-Williams Treaty, which signed from the Lake Simcoe all the way to Lake Ontario. Many communities inhabited from the north shore of Lake Ontario to Lake Nipissing. The communities that come under the Williams Treaty are the Mississaugas, which include the Curve Lake First Nations, the Eldeville First Nations, the Hiawatha First Nations, and the Scugog Island First Nations. The Chippewas include the Bay Soleil First Nations, the Georgina Island First Nations, and the Rama First Nations. The Williams Treaty's first traditional territories are located primarily in the watersheds of the Georgian Bay and Lake Ontario, and include some of the mainstream tributaries and streams. The so-called agreement between Indigenous communities and the Crown sounds somewhat fair on paper, but their actions are proved otherwise. The Williams Treaties were signed by the governments of Canada and Ontario, and by 7 First Nation of Lake Simcoe's Chippewa and the North Shore Mississauga of Lake Ontario in October and November 1923. During the signing of the agreement, the British Crown promised a sum of £740 province currency in goods at the Montreal price to be well and truly paid annually in return of surrender of the right on the lands that they inhabited. The impact of the treaties was detrimental to the Indigenous people. After the treaty agreement, they did not receive what was promised them, such as the annual sum payment, or the activities they enjoyed doing, like hunting and fishing on their own ancestral land. They did not receive a tract of land that was promised to them. Also, the implementation of the Indian Act led to have had a very bad impact on the flourishing Indian society. To elaborate on the Indian Act is a Canadian federal law that governs in matters pertaining to Indian status, bans, and Indian reserves. Throughout history, the Indian Act is highly interfering with the freedom of Indigenous people, as it authorizes the federal government of Canada to regulate and manages the affairs and daily lives of registered Indians and in reserve communities. The Indian Act is administered by the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development of Indian Northern Affairs of Canada. The Indian Act is part of a long history of assimilation policies aimed at ending Aboriginal people's cultural, social, economic, and political uniqueness by absorbing them into Canadian mainstream life values. The Indian Act also led to the creation of residential schools, which were governed and sponsored schools run by churches. The purpose of residential schools was to educate and convert Indigenous youth and integrate them into Canadian society. Overall, students at residential schools had a negative experience that had lasting consequences. Firstly, they were isolated from their culture, even forbidden from communicating in their mother tongue or first language. Secondly, their hair was cut short opposed to their culture norms and were issued uniforms, while the Christian officials criticizing Indigenous beliefs consistently. To combat this peacefully, the Indigenous protest to lead a Crown apology. The strict regime of residential schools was protested by the Aboriginal parents, and by the 1940s it was obvious to both the government and most missionary bodies that the schools were ineffective, and Indigenous protests helped to secure a change in policy. They also made knowledge more widespread so other tribes support their protests. In current day, reconciliation is apparent. For example, on November 17, 2018, in Rama, Ontario, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Honourable Carolyn Bennett, apologized on behalf of the Government of Canada for the negative impact of 1923 Williams Treaty on the First Nations Williams Treaty. Thank you for listening.